I have always believed that a house has a memory. I believed that the walls absorb the arguments, the laughter, the silence, and the secrets of the people who live within them, holding onto those vibrations long after the inhabitants have gone. When Sarah and I bought the Victorian on Hawthorne Street, I told myself we were buying a blank slate, despite its 100-year history. I was a carpenter by trade, a man who understood the logic of wood and stone, and I looked at the sagging porch and the peeling paint not as warning signs, but as invitations. I saw the potential for a masterpiece. I thought I was building a sanctuary for our future, unaware that I was merely constructing a stage set for a tragedy that had already begun in the wings. We had been married for 6 years, a period of time that felt both substantial and fleeting. Sarah was the vivid splash of color in my monochrome world of sawdust and blueprints. She was an interior designer, a woman who obsessed over textures and lighting, who could walk into a gray room and see the potential for warmth. We were a team. We were the couple who spent weekends covered in plaster dust, eating take-out pizza on the floor of an unfinished kitchen, tired but brimming with a shared vision. I trusted her with the architecture of my life just as implicitly as she trusted me with the structural integrity of our home. Or so I thought. The shift in our dynamic was subtle, like the slow warping of a door frame that eventually refuses to close. It began in the autumn, coinciding with the arrival of Julian, a high-profile architect she had been commissioned to collaborate with on a downtown restoration project. Julian was polished, articulate, and possessed a kind of effortless sophistication that made my rough hands and sawdust-covered boots feel clumsy in comparison. Sarah began to speak of him often, initially with professional admiration that slowly morphed into something more personal. She would recount his jokes, his insights, his tastes in wine. I dismissed my unease as insecurity, the petty jealousy of a husband who felt out of place in his wife's expanding world. I told myself that her late nights were a necessity of the industry, that her sudden need for privacy with her phone was just a symptom of high-stakes client confidentiality. The discovery did not happen through a phone or a text message. It happened through the house itself, the very thing I was pouring my sweat and blood into. It was a Thursday afternoon, and a storm had been battering the city for 2 days. I had come home early from a job site because the rain had made outdoor work impossible. The house was empty, or so I assumed. Sarah had told me that morning that she would be on site with Julian all day, reviewing the electrical layouts for their project. I decided to use the time to fix the wiring on our own front porch smart doorbell, which had been glitching, sending phantom notifications of movement when the street was empty. I sat in my study, logging into the cloud server to review the footage history, intending to calibrate the motion sensitivity. I scrolled back through the timeline, watching the mundane parade of mail carriers, stray cats, and wind-blown leaves. I was looking for technical glitches, but instead, I found a human one. I stopped at a timestamp from 2 days prior, Tuesday, 11 a.m., a time when Sarah was supposed to be at her office, and I was across town framing a deck. On the screen, I watched my own driveway. Sarah's car pulled in. She wasn't alone. The passenger door opened, and Julian stepped out. He didn't look like a colleague dropping off a coworker. He looked like a man who owned the space he was standing in. He walked around the car, and Sarah met him halfway. In the grainy, high-definition fisheye lens of the security camera, I watched my wife embrace this man. It wasn't a friendly hug. It was a desperate, clinging embrace. I watched his hands move to her waist, pulling her flush against him. I watched her face tilt up to his, her expression one of surrender. They kissed right there on the porch of the house I was rebuilding for us, under the shelter of the roof I had repaired with my own hands. Then, they unlocked the front door, my door, and walked inside. I sat in the study, the silence of the house suddenly deafening. The rain hammered against the window pane, a chaotic rhythm that mocked the stillness of my body. I didn't scream. I didn't throw the monitor. I felt a cold, creeping numbness start at my fingertips and work its way into my chest. It was the sensation of realizing that the floor joists you are standing on have rotted through, and it is only a matter of time before gravity claims its due. I clicked forward in the timeline. They didn't leave until 2 p.m. 3 hours. 3 hours in our bed. 3 hours in our sanctuary. I sat there for 4 hours, waiting. I watched the light fade from the room, shadows stretching across the floorboards like accusatory fingers. When I heard the front door unlock at 6:30 p.m., the sound was no longer the welcoming click of a partner returning home. It was the sound of an intruder breaching the perimeter. Sarah walked in, shaking a wet umbrella. She called out my name, her voice bright and cheerful, feigning the normalcy of a faithful wife. She came into the study, smelling of rain and the expensive perfume she only wore for meetings. She started to tell me about her day, weaving a complex fabrication about electrical layouts and difficult contractors. She lied with an ease that was terrifying. She lied with the same proficiency she used to choose paint colors smooth, confident, and designed to cover the truth. I didn't say a word. I simply turned the monitor around to face her. I pressed play. The silence that followed the video was heavier than the storm outside. It was a vacuum. I watched her face crumble. It wasn't a gradual realization. It was an instant collapse. The color drained from her skin, leaving her looking gray and sickly in the dim light. She dropped her bag. Her hands flew to her mouth, not in shock, but in the universal gesture of someone trying to hold back a scream or a vomit. She didn't try to deny it. The evidence was absolute. There was no ambiguity in the way she had looked at him, no innocent explanation for 3 hours in an empty house. When she finally spoke, her voice was a fractured whisper. She tried to apologize. She tried to explain that it was a mistake, a moment of weakness, a lapse in judgment that got out of control. She used words like confusion and passion and loneliness, throwing them at me like sandbags to stop a flood. She claimed that she and Julian had just connected in a way she hadn't expected, that she felt seen by him in a way she hadn't felt in years. She dared to suggest that my focus on the house, my obsession with the renovation, had left her feeling abandoned in the debris. I listened to her attempt to rewrite our history, to paint herself as the victim of my neglect rather than the perpetrator of her own betrayal. I felt a profound sense of nausea. It wasn't just the infidelity. It was the invasion. She had brought him here. She had brought the contamination into the one place that was supposed to be safe. She had looked at me across the dinner table for months, smiling, planning vacations, discussing the future, all while carrying the secret of him in her pocket. The emotional impact in the days that followed was like living in a house that had burned down, even though the walls were still standing. I moved into the unfinished guest room on the 3rd floor, surrounding myself with drop cloths and tools. I couldn't look at the master bedroom. I couldn't look at the kitchen island where we had drunk coffee. Every surface in the house felt coated in a film of slime. I went through the stages of grief, but they weren't linear. They were a chaotic spiral. I felt a rage so white-hot it made my hands shake, a desire to destroy the work I had done, to take a sledgehammer to the walls and expose the framing. I felt a crushing sadness, a grief for the death of the future I had imagined. I looked at the garden we had planted together and saw only weeds. But mostly, I felt a deep, abiding shame. I felt foolish. I had been the builder who missed the termites. I had been so focused on the aesthetics of our life that I hadn't noticed the foundation was dissolving. Sarah tried to fix it. She ended things with Julian. She quit the project. She slept on the couch, leaving me notes, making meals I didn't eat, pleading for a chance to rebuild trust. She spoke of counseling, of fresh starts, of forgiveness. She wanted to patch the crack in the wall and paint over it, pretending the structural damage wasn't there. But I knew about structures. I knew that once the rot gets into the beams, you can't just paint over it. You have to tear it out. And sometimes, the rot is so deep that the house is condemned. The decision came to me on a Tuesday, exactly 2 weeks after the discovery. I was sanding the banister of the main staircase. The repetitive motion usually calmed me, but that day, it brought clarity. I looked down at the grain of the wood, emerging from beneath layers of old varnish. I realized that I could sand this wood for 100 years. I could stain it and polish it until it shone, but it would still be the same piece of wood. and Sarah would still be the woman who brought Julian into our home. I realized that I could never look at her again without seeing the timestamp on that video. I could never touch her without wondering if his touch was the one she actually wanted. The trust wasn't just broken, it was pulverized. I put down the sandpaper. I didn't pack a bag. I didn't write a letter. I simply walked downstairs. Sarah was in the kitchen, reading a book she wasn't actually reading, waiting for me to descend, waiting for the thought. She looked up, hope flickering in her eyes like a dying candle. I looked at her and shook my head. It was a small movement, but it carried the weight of a final verdict. I told her that I was done. I told her that the house was hers, or the bank's, or whoever wanted it, but it was no longer mine. I told her that I couldn't live in a museum of lies. I saw the hope extinguish in her eyes, replaced by the terrifying realization of finality. She didn't argue. She saw the deadness in my face and knew there was nothing left to negotiate. I walked out the front door, past the spot on the porch where she had kissed him, and I didn't look back. I moved to a small cabin 2 hours north, a place that needed work, a place that smelled of pine needles and cold air. It has been a year now. I work with my hands. I build things for other people. I live simply. The silence here is different. It is the silence of nature. Indifferent and honest, I have learned that a home isn't made of bricks and mortar. It is made of truth. If the truth isn't there, the roof will eventually collapse, no matter how strong the beams are. I have learned to listen to the quiet intuition that speaks when things feel wrong, the internal structural engineer that warns of instability. To anyone standing in the ruins of a relationship, staring at the evidence of betrayal, feeling like the roof has caved in on their chest, I offer this. Do not try to live in the rubble. Do not try to patch the rot with hope. Walk away. It is better to sleep in the cold, open air of the truth than to be warm in a house built on a lie. You will build again, and next time, you will know to check the foundation before you lay the first stone.